Meet Sarah. To the outside world, she is the definition of the Canadian dream. She's 34, works a corporate job in downtown Toronto, and pulls in a respectable $90,000 a year. She wears the right clothes, drives a leased SUV that glows under the streetlights of Liberty Village, and posts photos of her weekend trips to Muskoka. But there is a shadow fact that Sarah hides from her friends, her family, and even herself. After 10 years of full-time professional work, her total savings amount to exactly $0. In fact, if you factor in her line of credit and the remaining balance on her OSAP, her net worth is deeply negative. This isn't just Sarah's story. It is the silent epidemic sweeping across the Great White North. We are told that if we work hard, go to school, and get a good job, the rest will follow. But in 2024, the math has changed. The Canadian middle class is being hollowed out by 1,000 tiny cuts, and most people don't even realize they're bleeding until the wound is fatal. Today, we are going to look under the hood of a lost decade to understand how a high earner can end up with nothing, and why the system is designed to keep you exactly where you are, running on a treadmill that's getting faster every single day. The first major trap Sarah fell into is what we call the lease-to-own psychological loop. In Canada, we have become a nation of monthly payments rather than owners. When Sarah got her first big promotion, she didn't think about the total cost of a vehicle. She thought about the bi-weekly payment. The dealership told her it was only $250 every 2 weeks. It sounded manageable. But what they didn't tell her, and what she didn't calculate, was the opportunity cost. That money, if invested in a simple S&P 500 index fund inside a TFSA, would have grown to over $80,000 over that decade. Instead, it went into a depreciating asset that lost half its value the moment she drove it off the lot. This is the shadow fact of Canadian consumerism. We are encouraged to buy a lifestyle we haven't earned, using money we haven't made to impress people we don't even like. The pressure to maintain an image in cities like Vancouver or Toronto is suffocating. We see our peers with the latest iPhones and Canada Goose tickets, and we assume they've made it. The reality is, most of them are one missed paycheck away from total collapse. Sarah was living a 5-star life on a 1-star balance sheet, and the gap was widening every year. Then comes the visceral, daily pain that every Canadian feels in their gut, the Loblaws effect. 10 years ago, Sarah could walk into a grocery store with $50 and come out with bags full of fresh produce, meat, and essentials. Today, that same $50 barely covers a block of cheese, some chicken breasts, and a carton of eggs. The inflation of basic necessities in Canada has outpaced wage growth by a staggering margin. Sarah found herself spending nearly $900 a month just to feed herself. She wasn't eating caviar, she was buying frozen vegetables and store-brand bread. The oligopoly of Canadian grocery giants has created a landscape where the average worker is essentially working the first 3 hours of their day just to pay for their dinner. This is where the emotional fatigue sets in. When you work 45 hours a week and you still feel like you have to check the price of butter before putting it in your cart, something inside you breaks. It creates a scarcity mindset that actually leads to worse financial decisions. Sarah started revenge spending on small luxuries like expensive lattes or takeout because she felt like she couldn't afford the big things anyway. It's a psychological trap. When the dream of homeownership feels impossible, you settle for the comfort of a $20 avocado toast.
We cannot talk about Sarah's lost decade without addressing the silent partner in her bank account, the Canada Revenue Agency. Sarah's $90,000 salary sounds impressive on paper, but after the federal and provincial tax bite, the CPP contributions, and the employment insurance premiums, her take-home pay was significantly lower. In Ontario, she was losing nearly 25% of her gross income before a single cent hit her bank account. As she received raises over the years, she fell victim to bracket creep. Every time she worked harder and earned more, the government took a larger percentage. By the time she paid her mandatory contributions, her high salary felt more like a survival wage. The shadow fact here is that the Canadian tax system is heavily weighted against the professional middle class, those who earn enough to be taxed heavily, but not enough to afford sophisticated tax shelters or corporate structures. Sarah was doing everything right, but she was playing a game where the rules were tilted against her. She didn't realize that for every dollar she earned, she was only keeping 65 cents, yet her expenses were calculated on the full dollar. This disconnect is the primary reason why many Canadians feel like they are drowning, even as their salaries increase. You aren't just fighting inflation, you're fighting a fiscal system that views your success as a revenue stream. The most significant weight around Sarah's neck was her rent. Living in the GTA, she watched as the cost of a one-bedroom apartment climbed from $1,500 to over $2,500 in just a few short years. To be close to her job and maintain a semblance of a social life, she stayed in the city. Over 10 years, Sarah paid over $240,000 in rent. That is nearly $250,000 that vanished into her landlord's mortgage, building equity for someone else while she was left with nothing but a collection of rent receipts. This is the death of the Canadian dream, the transition from a nation of homeowners to a nation of permanent tenants. The psychological toll of knowing that you are paying someone else's retirement fund while your own is empty is immense. Sarah often looked at the housing market, seeing average home prices in the millions, and felt a sense of nihilism. If a starter home costs $800,000 and requires a $160,000 down payment, why even try to save? This giving up phase is when the real damage happens. Sarah stopped looking at her bank statements entirely, choosing the bliss of ignorance over the agony of reality. But ignorance has a high interest rate, and eventually the bill always comes due. Sarah made a mistake that millions of Canadians make every year. She misunderstood the TFSA. She had a tax-free savings account, but she used it as a glorified emergency fund that she constantly dipped into. She treated it like a regular savings account, keeping it in cash and earning a measly 1% interest. She didn't realize that the S in TFSA is a misnomer. It should be called a tax-free investment account. By not using that contribution room to buy income-generating assets or growth stocks, she missed out on a decade of the greatest bull market in history. While she was worrying about the price of gas, the people who understood the system were compounding their wealth tax-free. This is the knowledge gap that separates the struggling middle class from the wealthy. The system doesn't teach you how to use these tools in school. It teaches you how to be a good employee and a consistent consumer. Sarah was a perfect student of that system. She contributed a little here and there, but whenever a crisis came up, a wedding in Montreal, a car repair, a new laptop, she would drain the account. She was resetting her progress to zero every 18 months, never allowing the power of compound interest to take hold. She was planting seeds and then digging them up a week later to see if they were growing. Lifestyle inflation is a slow-acting poison. For Sarah, it didn't happen all at once. It started with upgrading her gym membership from a budget spot to a boutique spin studio. Then it was the transition from fast fashion to investment pieces that cost 4 times as much. It was the subscription services, Netflix, Disney+, Spotify, meal kits, and cloud storage that quietly drained $300 a month from her account without her even noticing. Each individual expense seemed small, almost insignificant. What's another $15 a month? But in the aggregate, these expenses were the anchors dragging her down. In the Canadian context, we call this the Durand syndrome, the need to match the lifestyle of the most successful person in your social circle. If your friend buys a house in Oakville, you feel the need to upgrade your car. If your colleague goes to Iceland, you book a trip to Portugal. We are a country that is obsessed with the appearance of stability. Sarah was terrified of appearing poor or behind, so she used her credit card to bridge the gap between her reality and her aspirations. She was living a life she couldn't afford to maintain, a status she didn't actually have. The emotional pain of this charade is exhausting. It's a constant state of high alert, fearing the moment someone looks too closely at the numbers. Then the world changed. The Bank of Canada began its aggressive interest rate hiking cycle to combat the very inflation that was already squeezing Sarah. Suddenly, the cheap debt she had relied on wasn't cheap anymore. The interest on her $10,000 line of credit doubled. The monthly cost of her debt service began to eat into her grocery budget. This is the interest rate nightmare that has hit millions of Canadians. We spent a decade in a low interest rate environment that encouraged us to borrow, and now the bill has arrived with a vengeance. For Sarah, this was the moment the walls started closing in. She was no longer just not saving, she was actively losing ground. Every month, more of her paycheck went to the bank in the form of interest, money that provided her no benefit, no product, and no future. It was pure waste. She felt betrayed by the financial institutions that had told her for years that debt was a tool for growth.
She realized that she wasn't the one using the tool, she was the one being used by it. The stress of the Bank of Canada announcements became a ritualistic torture, waiting to see if her life would get 5% harder with the stroke of a pen in Ottawa. In the midst of her struggle, Sarah turned to a modern financial trap: buy now, pay later. These services, integrated into almost every Canadian online retailer, offered her a way to keep up appearances without the immediate sting of a large payment. It seemed like a miracle. A $400 coat became 4 easy payments of $100. But Sarah didn't just do it once, she did it for everything. Soon, she had 12 different installments hitting her bank account at different times throughout the month. This is the digital decay of the bank balance. When your money is fragmented into dozens of tiny automated withdrawals, you lose the pain of paying. You no longer feel the loss of the money because it's a series of microtransactions. This is exactly what the fintech companies want. They want to decouple the pleasure of the purchase from the reality of the cost. For Sarah, this led to a total loss of financial clarity. She had no idea how much she actually owed or where her money was going. She was navigating a blizzard without a compass. The shadow fact of BNPL is that it targets the most vulnerable, those who are already stretched thin, and encourages them to gamble with their future cash flow for a momentary dopamine hit in the present. Entering her 10th year of work, Sarah hit a wall of mid-career crisis. She looked at her younger colleagues, 22-year-olds just starting out, and realized they were in the exact same financial position as her: zero net worth. The only difference was that she had 10 years of wear and tear on her body and mind. This is the visceral realization that time is your most precious asset, and she had traded 10 years of it for what? A closet full of clothes that were out of style, some electronics that were obsolete, and memories of dinners she couldn't really afford. This is the empty decade syndrome. In Canada, we are conditioned to believe that our houses will be our retirement. But for people like Sarah who couldn't get into the market, there is no safety net. The CPP is not enough to live on, and her company's RRSP matching program was something she had ignored because she needed the cash now. She was staring down the barrel of a future where she would have to work until she was 75 just to survive. The curiosity gap here is, how many people in your office are in this exact same position? The answer is more than you think. In every Canadian suburb and downtown core, there are Sarahs who are hiding the fact that they are essentially broke professionals. The breaking point for Sarah didn't come from a massive catastrophe. It came from a mundane one. Her car needed new brakes and a set of winter tires, a standard Canadian expense. The quote was $1,800. In a healthy financial life, this would be an annoyance, a dip into the emergency fund. For Sarah, it was a total system failure. She didn't have the $1,800. Her credit cards were near their limits, and her line of credit was tapped out. She sat in the waiting room of the mechanic shop in Mississauga, feeling a level of shame that was physically painful. She was a successful woman who couldn't afford tires. This is the reality of the fragile middle class. We live on a knife's edge, where one car repair or one dental emergency can send the entire house of cards tumbling down. The stress of that day changed her. She realized that her life was a performance, and she was the only one in the audience who knew it was a tragedy. She had to decide, would she continue the lie, or would she face the brutal facts of her existence? The curiosity gap remains. What happens when the next black swan event hits Canada? If a set of tires can break a $90,000 a year professional, how will the nation survive a real recession? Sarah began to audit her life, and the first thing she looked at was the subscription bleed. She realized she was paying for 3 different music services, 4 streaming platforms, a premium LinkedIn account she didn't use, and a meal kit service that often went to waste. This digital decay was costing her nearly $4,000 a year. Over 10 years, that was $40,000, enough for a down payment on a condo in some parts of the country a few years ago. But it wasn't just the money, it was the mental clutter these services created. Every subscription was a small tether to a lifestyle of consumption. The shadow fact is that these companies design their cancellation flows to be as difficult as possible, relying on decision fatigue to keep you paying. Sarah spent an entire Saturday afternoon just trying to claw back her own income from these digital vampires. It was an act of war. She felt a strange sense of power as she clicked cancel on each one. It was the first time in a decade she had felt in control of her financial destiny.
But the subscriptions were just the tip of the iceberg. The real monsters were still lurking in her spending habits and her mindset about what it means to be a successful Canadian.
Next, she tackled the RRSP illusion. For years, Sarah had contributed small amounts to her RRSP just to get a tax refund. She viewed the refund as free money from the government, which she promptly spent on a spring vacation. This is a catastrophic misunderstanding of the Registered Retirement Savings Plan. An RRSP is a tax deferral mechanism, not a tax elimination one. By spending the refund instead of reinvesting it, she was effectively taking a loan from her future self and spending it on a week in Mexico. This is a common Canadian trap, the tax refund high. We feel like we've won a prize, but in reality, we are just getting back an overpayment of our own money. Sarah realized that by spending those refunds, she had halved the effective growth of her retirement account over 10 years. She was shocked to see that if she had simply reinvested those refunds, her account would be worth double what it was. This is the shadow math that keeps the middle class poor. We are taught to look at the short-term win, the check in the mail, rather than the long-term wealth destruction. Sarah had to face the fact that her free vacations had actually cost her tens of thousands of dollars in future security.
The mental health toll of Sarah's situation began to manifest in her work. Financial anxiety isn't just a number on a screen, it's a physiological state. It's the tight chest when the phone rings from an unknown number, fearing it's a debt collector. It's the inability to focus on a presentation because you're calculating how much you need to make it to Friday. Sarah found herself becoming more risk-averse at her job. She couldn't speak up or push for changes because she was terrified of being fired. When you have no savings, your employer owns more than just your time. They own your voice. This is the debt-induced silence of the Canadian workforce. We have a nation of people who are too scared to innovate or take risks because they are one paycheck away from the street. This stagnation is why Canada's productivity is lagging behind. We aren't a nation of entrepreneurs. We are a nation of people clinging to the edge of a cliff. Sarah realized that her lack of savings had robbed her of her professional courage. She was playing not to lose instead of playing to win. The curiosity gap is haunting. How much human potential is being wasted in Canada right now because people are too financially stressed to dream?
Social media only made the pain worse. Every time Sarah opened Instagram, she was bombarded with images of people her age who seemed to have it all figured out. She saw property influencers talking about their 10-door portfolios and friends posting about their new custom-built homes in the suburbs. This created a sense of relative poverty. Even though she was in the top 10% of earners globally, she felt like a failure in the context of the Canadian dream as portrayed online. The shadow fact is that most of what we see is a lie. Many of those 10-door portfolios are leveraged to the hilt, and those custom homes are often funded by the bank of mom and dad. Sarah was comparing her internal reality to everyone else's external highlight reel. This comparison is the thief of joy and the driver of bad debt. She felt she needed to keep up, but she was racing against ghosts. The visceral feeling of falling behind while everyone else moves forward is a uniquely modern Canadian agony, fueled by a housing market that has turned into a national spectator sport. Sarah had to learn to mute the noise, but the silence that followed was even more terrifying because it forced her to look at her own reflection.
Sarah also discovered the shadow expenses of her life. She lived in a condo, and for years she had ignored the rising condo fees. They had started at $300 a month and were now nearly $700. Then there was the carbon tax effect on her heating and gas bills, and the property tax increases passed down through her rent. In Canada, there are dozens of these hidden costs that are indexed to inflation or government policy, and they act like a slow leak in a boat. You don't notice the water rising until your feet are wet. Sarah realized that her fixed costs weren't actually fixed. They were a shifting target. To survive, she had to become a detective of her own life. She began tracking every single cent, using a spreadsheet that became her new Bible. She found that she was losing hundreds of dollars a month to convenience fees, ATM charges, delivery surcharges, and service fees on tickets. These are the taxes on the disorganized. The system is designed to reward the meticulous and punish the distracted. Sarah had been distracted for 10 years, and the distraction tax she had paid was enough to have changed her life. She was finally waking up to the reality that in Canada, if you aren't paying attention, you are being harvested. The moment of total clarity, the bottom, happened at a Tim Hortons. Sarah went to buy a large double-double and a muffin, a $5 transaction. Her card was declined. Not because she didn't have $5 in her account, but because her bank had frozen her card due to a missed payment on her line of credit. She stood there, the smell of cheap coffee and sugar in the air, with a line of people behind her, and felt the hot sting of public humiliation. It was the ultimate Canadian tragedy, failing at the one place that is supposed to be for everyone. She walked out without her coffee, sat in her car, and cried for an hour. This was the system reset. The shame was so great that it finally overrode her ego. She could no longer pretend. She went home, printed out 2 years of bank statements, and laid them out on her floor. She saw the story of her life written in red ink. It was a story of waste, of fear, and of a desperate attempt to belong to a middle class that no longer existed. This is the shadow fact Sarah finally accepted. The version of Canada she was trying to live in died 20 years ago. She was trying to survive in a new, harsher reality, using an old, obsolete map.
The audit was brutal. Sarah calculated that over the last decade, she had earned approximately $900,000 in gross income. Looking at her empty bank account, she realized that she had effectively spent $1 million life and had nothing to show for it but some used furniture and a closet of old clothes. This is the $1 million hole. Most Canadians will earn millions of dollars over their working lives, yet most will reach retirement with almost nothing. The money passes through our hands like water through a sieve. Sarah saw that her biggest expense wasn't rent or taxes, it was friction. It was the money spent because she was tired, the money spent because she was bored, and the money spent because she was sad. She realized that her spending was a series of emotional reactions, not logical decisions. She had been using her paycheck as a drug to numb the pain of her lifestyle. This realization was visceral. She felt like she had been asleep for 10 years and had just woken up in a burning building. But the fire wasn't outside, it was her own habits. She had to decide if she was going to save herself or let the decade of debt define the rest of her life. Sarah's pivot began with a radical rejection of the Canadian status quo. She did the unthinkable. She sold her SUV, paid off a portion of the loan, and started taking the GO train and the TTC. The first week was a nightmare. She felt like she had demoted herself. She was surrounded by the very people she had spent 10 years trying to stay above. But then something strange happened. She found she had an hour each way to read, to think, and to plan. She saved $700 a month on gas, insurance, and lease payments. She then moved out of her Liberty Village condo and into a much smaller basement apartment in a less trendy part of the city. Her friends stopped calling. She wasn't at the right brunch stops anymore. This is the social death that comes with financial recovery. You have to be willing to be uncool to be free. Sarah realized that the system is rigged to keep you in a cycle of debt by making the alternative look like failure. But for the first time in 10 years, she had an extra $1,500 at the end of the month. She wasn't failing, she was finally starting to win. Sarah's pivot began with a radical rejection of the Canadian status quo. She did the unthinkable. She sold her SUV, paid off a portion of the loan, and started taking the GO train and the TTC. The first week was a nightmare. She felt like she had demoted herself. She was surrounded by the very people she had spent 10 years trying to stay above. But then, something strange happened. She found she had an hour each way to read, to think, and to plan. She saved $700 a month on gas, insurance, and lease payments. She then moved out of her Liberty Village condo and into a much smaller basement apartment in a less trendy part of the city. Her friends stopped calling. She wasn't at the right brunch spots anymore. This is the social death that comes with financial recovery. You have to be willing to be uncool to be free. Sarah realized that the system is rigged to keep you in a cycle of debt by making the alternative look like failure. But for the first time in 10 years, she had an extra $1,500 at the end of the month. She wasn't failing. She was finally starting to win. 2 years after her bottom at Tim Hortons, Sarah's life is unrecognizable. She still makes $90,000, but she lives on $40,000. She has paid off her consumer debt and her OSAP. She has $50,000 in her TFSA, and it's growing every month. The stress that used to sit like a lead weight in her stomach is gone. she has FU money. Not enough to retire, but enough to say no to a toxic boss or a bad deal. This is the freedom gap. The difference between $0 and $50,000 is infinite. It's the difference between being a slave to the system and being a participant in it. Sarah's recovery plan was simple but painful. Face the facts, cut the ego, and play the long game. She realized that Canada is a beautiful country, but it is a hard country for those who are financially illiterate. The middle class isn't disappearing, it's just becoming a choice. You can choose to look middle class and be broke, or you can choose to look poor and become wealthy. Sarah chose the latter, and for the first time in her life, she isn't afraid of the future. She is the architect of it.
But here is the final open loop, the shadow fact that should keep you up tonight. Sarah is the exception, not the rule. Most Canadians are still on the treadmill. Household debt in Canada is now the highest in the G7. We are a nation built on a foundation of mortgages we can barely afford and lifestyles funded by credit. The next 5 years will be a period of great correction, as the low interest rate era officially dies and the cost of basic living remains high. The Sarahs who don't wake up will find themselves in a position they cannot recover from. The system isn't going to save you. The CRA isn't going to give you a break. The grocery giants aren't going to lower their prices out of the goodness of their hearts. You are on your own. Sarah's 10 lost years were a high price to pay for a lesson, but she paid it. The question is, how many years have you lost? And more importantly, how many more are you willing to give up before you decide to change the math? The Canadian dream isn't dead, but it's no longer for sale on a payment plan. You have to build it, brick by brick, with